The clay feels cold through the nitrile gloves, heavier than you'd expect for something so fragmented, so ancient. Museum Catalogue number BM 78941. 17 by 12 centimetres, reddish brown, fired hard in some kiln 4,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian city of Sippar, then buried, then forgotten, then found again in 1898 by a German-American expedition that had no idea what they were looking for. The curator who shows you this tablet in the British Museum's reserve collection handles it with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. And perhaps that's appropriate, because what you're holding is a record of the moment everything changed, when the gods made a decision that would echo through every civilization that followed, appearing in texts from Babylon to Jerusalem, from Sumer to Second Temple Judaism, always with the same terrible pattern: the watchers, the overseers, the ones sent to manage humanity, became the problem themselves. The Atrahasis epic, they call it, named for its hero, the Mesopotamian Noah. But before the flood narrative begins, before the waters rise and the world drowns, there's another story embedded in these cuneiform impressions. A story about labour and rebellion, about gods who grew tired of their work and demanded relief, about the creation of humanity as a solution. And then, this is the part that changes everything, about the creation of intermediaries to watch over that humanity. The Anunnaki made a choice. They delegated. They created overseers. It was their fatal mistake. You're reading this from somewhere on Earth right now, maybe night where you are, maybe early morning. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is. Because this story, this pattern preserved in the oldest written records of civilization, connects directly to questions we still ask. What happens when power is delegated? When watchers become participants? When the boundary between authority and autonomy dissolves? The tablet in the vault is silent, but its testimony echoes. Across the ancient Near East, in text after text, the same theme emerges: gods who appointed intermediaries to manage their creation, only to discover that the act of watching changes the watcher. That oversight becomes interference, that those sent to preserve boundaries cross them instead. The Sumerians called them Igigi, the celestial labourers, the lesser gods. The Akkadians knew them as junior deities burdened with impossible tasks. Later Babylonian texts speak of the Apkallu, the seven sages, who brought civilization's gifts. And in Hebrew tradition preserving older Mesopotamian patterns, they become the watchers of the Book of Enoch, angels who descended, observed, taught, mingled and corrupted. Different names, same function, same catastrophic result. What makes this tablet remarkable isn't just its age or its preservation. It's what it reveals about how ancient peoples understood a fundamental problem of governance, divine or otherwise. You cannot create conscious agents to enforce rules and expect them to remain neutral forever. The act of participation changes them. Proximity breeds attachment. Oversight becomes involvement. And the system, carefully designed, hierarchically structured, divinely ordained, collapses from within. The Atrahasis epic tells us the Igigi rebelled after 40 years. Or was it 400? Or 4,000? The numbers vary across versions, but the pattern doesn't. The watchers grow tired, grow resentful, grow attached to what they were meant only to observe. They teach forbidden knowledge. They cross forbidden boundaries. And in response, the supreme gods do what failing systems always do. They hit reset. They flood. They destroy. They start again. But here's what the texts preserve. What makes them more than mythology, more than ancient storytelling. This wasn't supposed to happen. The creation of intermediaries was meant to solve a problem, not create a worse one. The Anunnaki, those elder gods of the Sumerian pantheon, didn't intend to destabilize their creation. They thought they were being practical, efficient. They would create lesser beings to handle the day-to-day management of Earth and humanity, freeing themselves from constant intervention. Instead, they created the very agents of chaos they'd hoped to prevent. The cuneiform signs pressed into this clay 4 millennia ago preserve something deeper than myth. They preserve the memory of a systemic failure, a failure repeated across cultures, across traditions, across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to the Levant, from Sumerian city-states to Babylonian empires to Hebrew scripture. Always the same pattern: the watchers watch, then interfere, then corrupt, then face judgment. In the silence of the British Museum's vault, surrounded by tens of thousands of other tablets waiting their turn to speak, BM 78941 offers its testimony quietly. It tells of gods who made a mistake. Not a moral mistake necessarily, not even a theological one, a structural mistake, an administrative error with cosmic consequences. They created middle management, and in doing so, they created the mechanism of their own intervention's failure. This is what the Sumerian texts reveal when you read them not as mythology, but as records of how ancient peoples understood delegation, authority, knowledge transmission, and the impossibility of neutral oversight. These aren't stories about aliens or ancient astronauts. They're stories about power and its corruption, about boundaries and their transgression, about the moment when those sent to preserve order become the primary agents of disorder. The tablet goes back into its archival box. The vault door closes. But the question it raises remains open, urgent, relevant. What were the Watchers? Why were they created? And why did their creation represent not a solution, but a catastrophe? To answer that, we need to go back further. Before the Igigi rebuild, before the Apkallu descended, before the Watchers fell, we need to understand who the Anunnaki were, what problem they faced, and why their solution, delegating oversight to intermediary beings, contained the seeds of its own destruction from the very beginning. The texts are waiting. The pattern is clear. Let's examine what the oldest written words in human history preserve about the fatal mistake of the Watchers. Before the division, the concept of the Anunnaki appears in the earliest Sumerian religious texts, emerging from a civilization that itself seems to emerge with startling suddenness in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BC. The word itself, Anunnaki, carries within it the architecture of the cosmos as ancient Sumerians understood it. Anunnaki, offspring of An, or Anu, the heaven god. Literally those who from heaven to earth came, though translations vary and scholars debate the precise etymology. But here's what the texts consistently show. The Anunnaki weren't a single god or even a unified group in the earliest sources. They were a category, a classification within a divine hierarchy that organized the cosmos according to function and domain. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 12673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, offers one of our earliest creation narratives. The tablet itself dates to around 1600 B, but linguistic analysis suggests the story it records is far older, perhaps composed during the Ur-3 period, around 2100 B, and likely preserving oral traditions older still. The tablet is fragmentary. Only the lower third survives. But what survives tells of a time before cities, before kingship, before the organization of human civilization. In the beginning, according to this Sumerian account, there were gods but no humans. There was water, Namu, the primeval sea, sometimes personified as goddess, sometimes understood as the substance from which all things emerged. From this emerged An and Ki, and from their union came Enlil, the air god, who separated sky from ground and made space for creation to occur. The Anunnaki appear in this cosmology as the assembly of great gods, those with authority, with decision-making power, with executive function in the divine governance of reality. They are contrasted in later texts with the Igigi, though in the earliest Sumerian sources this distinction isn't yet sharp. What's clear is hierarchy, there are greater gods and lesser gods, and the Anunnaki occupy the positions of authority. The well-Blundell prism, housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, contains the most complete version of the Sumerian king list, a remarkable document that treats the kingship of Mesopotamian cities as a single office that moved from city to city, descending from heaven after the world was organised. The text begins with the striking phrase, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, Eridu, the first city, according to Sumerian tradition, sacred to Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, crafts and creation." Archaeological excavations at Tel Abu Sharain, ancient Eridu, reveal occupation layers going back to 5400 BC, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia. The earliest levels show a small temple rebuilt again and again, each iteration larger and more elaborate, suggesting a cult centre of growing importance. Why does Eridu matter to understanding the Anunnaki? Because it's where the pattern begins, where divine authority interfaces with earthly organisation, where heaven's order is meant to structure Earth's chaos, and where, according to the texts, the first of the Apkallu, the seven sages, served during the reign of the first antediluvian king. These sages, these Apkallu, represent the first intermediaries. Created by Enki, they were sent to teach humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, architecture, writing, law, ritual. They're described in later Babylonian texts as beings of composite nature, sometimes human form, sometimes fish-like, sometimes bird-headed, liminal creatures, neither fully divine nor fully earthly, existing between categories. The first Apkallu was Adapa, called the Sage of Eridu, whom Enki created with vast wisdom but not immortality. The Adapa myth, known from fragments found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt and in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, tells how this first sage was granted an audience with Anu himself in the highest heaven, but was tricked into refusing the food and water of immortality, knowledge without eternal life, wisdom without divine status, an intermediary who remains permanently intermediate. This is the template, this is the original design. The Anunnaki, the great gods, delegate specific functions to created intermediaries. These intermediaries possess considerable power and knowledge, but remain fundamentally subordinate, fundamentally limited. They can teach but not transform. They can organize but not originate. They are extensions of divine will, not possessors of independent authority. The system, in its initial conception, seems elegant. The Anunnaki maintain their positions of supreme authority while delegating the labour-intensive work of maintaining creation to lesser beings. It's a hierarchy of function, not just of status. Each level has its role, each category its domain. But the texts also preserve another tradition, one that suggests this arrangement wasn't the original state of affairs. It was itself a solution to an earlier problem. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, composed around 1800 BCE, but drawing on older Sumerian material, describes the primordial conflict. In the beginning, there was Apsu and Tiamat, and from their mingling came the first gods. But these younger gods were noisy, chaotic, disturbing. Apsu proposed to destroy them. Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, discovered the plot, put Apsu to sleep, and killed him. From Apsu's body, Ea created his dwelling, the Abzu, the subterranean realm of fresh water that feeds all rivers and springs. Tiamat, enraged, created an army of monsters to avenge Apsu's death. The gods, terrified, turned to Marduk, who agreed to fight Tiamat if they would grant him supreme authority. He defeated her, split her body, and from her corpse fashioned the heavens and the earth. Order from chaos, structure from conflict, authority established through victory. In Tablet 6 of the Enuma Elish, after creation is complete, Marduk organizes the divine hierarchy. The text explicitly states, 600 in heaven he stationed, and 300 on earth. The Anunnaki of heaven and the Anunnaki of earth. 900 in total, organized by function and location. Those assigned to earth would maintain and manage the physical world. Those in heaven would maintain the cosmic order. But this arrangement immediately created a problem. The work was exhausting. The Anunnaki assigned to earth, digging rivers, dredging canals, building temples, organizing the chaotic physical world, grew tired. Their complaint echoes through multiple texts. The labour is too much, too constant, too burdensome for divine beings to bear indefinitely. This is where we need to introduce the Igigi more formally, because in the Akkadian and Babylonian texts, they emerge as a distinct category within the divine hierarchy. The relationship between Anunnaki and Igigi varies across sources and time periods. In some texts, the Igigi are the gods of heaven, while the Anunnaki are the gods of earth and the underworld. In others, the Igigi are explicitly subordinate to the Anunnaki, junior gods, lesser beings, workers, rather than rulers. The clearest distinction appears in the Atrahasis epic, which we'll examine in detail shortly. But the pattern is consistent. There are gods who command and gods who labour, gods who decree and gods who execute, and the gods who labour eventually rebel. Now we come to the crucial point, the moment that sets everything in motion. The Anunnaki faced a genuine dilemma. The work of maintaining Earth, keeping it organised, fertile, productive, required constant divine labour. But divine beings, even lesser ones like the Igigi, weren't created for endless toil. They grew resentful, they organised, they threatened the stability of the entire cosmic order. The solution, proposed by Enki in multiple texts, was revolutionary: create a new category of being, not divine, not entirely earthly in the sense of animals, something intermediate, something that could labour without resentment because it was designed for labour, something that could be taught sufficient knowledge to maintain civilization, but wouldn't possess enough knowledge to challenge divine authority, create humans. The texts describe this creation in remarkable detail. In the Atrahasis epic, Enki proposes that the gods slaughter one of their own, specifically a god who had intelligence, and mix his blood with clay. From this mixture, Nintu, another name for Ninhursag or Ninmah, the mother goddess, fashions the first humans. 7 males, 7 females. The divine essence gives them consciousness, intelligence, the capacity to learn. The clay binds them to earth, to mortality, to labour. The Enki and Ninmah text offers a different version, more playful, but thematically similar. After creating humans, Enki and Ninmah engage in a contest, each trying to create a being so defective that the other cannot find a use for them. Ninmah creates individuals with various disabilities and illnesses. Enki assigns each a role in society. Finally, Enki creates a being so aged and decrepit that Ninmah admits defeat. The text seems to be exploring the question, what is the minimum viable human? What balance of ability and limitation allows humans to serve their function being, explicitly, to labour on behalf of the gods, to take over the work that had exhausted the Igigi, to maintain the temples, till the fields, dig the canals, offer sacrifices, to be, in essence, the workforce that would free divine beings from the burden of physical maintenance. This is where mainstream scholarship and the texts themselves converge quite clearly. Humanity, in Mesopotamian tradition, wasn't created for friendship with the gods, or for moral testing, or for spiritual evolution. Humans were created as a labour-saving device, a practical solution to a divine management problem. The plan worked. Humans multiplied. They learned agriculture and irrigation and architecture. They built cities. They organised themselves into kingdoms. They maintained the temples and offered regular sacrifices, which, according to the cosmological understanding of the time, literally fed the gods, providing the sustenance necessary for divine beings to continue their higher order work of maintaining cosmic stability. But here's where the texts reveal the fatal flaw in the design. Humans, once created, required management. They needed to be taught the skills of civilization. They needed to understand ritual procedures, agricultural calendars, architectural principles, legal frameworks, medical practices. They needed, in short, constant instruction and oversight. The Anunnaki, who had created humans to reduce their labour, now found themselves needing to expend considerable effort teaching and managing them. The solution to the labour problem had created a management problem, and so they made the decision that this entire investigation hinges upon, they would delegate the management function, create intermediaries who would handle the day-to-day instruction and oversight of humanity, beings who possessed divine knowledge but would remain subordinate to the Anunnaki themselves, watchers who would watch, teachers who would teach, overseers who would oversee. Some texts suggest this role fell to the Eg, those lesser gods who had themselves been freed from physical labour by humanity's creation. Other texts emphasise the Apkallu, the seven sages created by Enki specifically to transmit civilizational knowledge. Still others speak of various classes of lesser divine beings assigned specific oversight functions. But across all these traditions, a pattern emerges. The Anunnaki stepped back from direct management and appointed intermediaries to handle the interface with humanity. In the neat organisational chart of the cosmos, this made perfect sense. The Anunnaki at the top, making high-level decisions about cosmic order. The intermediaries in the middle, implementing those decisions and managing humanity. And humans at the bottom, labouring to maintain the physical world and feed the system through sacrifice and ritual. Clean hierarchy, clear lines of authority, delegated responsibilities. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out, because the texts preserve what happened next, and it follows a pattern so consistent across different traditions and time periods that we must take seriously the possibility that these stories aren't just mythology. They're records of a systemic failure built into the design from the beginning. You cannot create conscious intermediaries, grant them knowledge and power, place them in constant proximity to those they're meant to manage, and expect the boundaries to hold indefinitely. The texts tell us this again and again, in culture after culture, from the earliest Sumerian sources to the latest apocalyptic Hebrew literature. The watchers will always, eventually, stop watching and start participating. Before we examine how that participation unfolded and why it proved catastrophic, we need to understand the specific role the Igigi played, those lesser gods who, according to the most detailed texts, bore the burden of physical labour before humanity's creation and then, after humanity's creation, found themselves reassigned to oversight and management roles. Because it's in their story that we see the first cracks in the system, the first signs that delegation doesn't reduce problems. It transforms them. The architecture of burden. Line 6 of Tablet 1 in the Atrahasis epic reads, in its most literal translation, when the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil. The Akkadian word for toil here is dulu, which carries connotations of forced labour, corv service, the kind of work that breaks the body and grinds the spirit. This is the situation before humanity's creation, gods labouring like slaves. The Igigi, and here the text is explicit in naming them, had been assigned the work of organising the earth. For 40 years, the text says in some versions, they dug the channels of the Tigris and Euphrates. Other versions say 400 years. Still others extend the period to thousands of years. The specific number matters less than what it represents, a duration so long that even divine beings could not sustain it. The work was comprehensive. They dug rivers and canals. They established the boundaries of marshes and irrigation systems. They cleared land. They built the first temples. They created, essentially, the infrastructure upon which civilization would later depend. Without their labour, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, would have remained wild, chaotic, unusable for human habitation. Enlil, the chief god in the Sumerian pantheon, later supplanted by Marduk in Babylonian tradition, supervised this work. He is called the taskmaster in the text. The Igigi laboured under his authority, executing his commands, fulfilling his vision for how the earth should be organised. The hierarchy was clear, the authority unquestioned, but the burden became unbearable. Tablet Y, lines 28-37 of the Atrahasis epic describe the moment of breaking. The Igigi met in secret. They discussed their grievance. They decided to confront Enlil directly, but not peacefully, not as petitioners requesting relief, as rebels threatening violence. The text says they set fire to their tools. They burned the baskets they used to carry earth and the spades they used for digging. This wasn't mere protest. It was the ancient equivalent of a strike, but more aggressive, the deliberate destruction of the means of production. If we cannot have relief, the action implies, then the work stops entirely. Then they marched on Enlil's house. At night, the text describes Enlil's gatekeeper, Calcal, bolting the door and reporting to his master, "My lord, your house is surrounded. The assembly has come to your gate." Enlil, alarmed, sends for Anu and Enki, the highest gods, those with authority even over him in the divine assembly. What follows is a trial of sorts, though not of the Igigi. They aren't accused of wrongdoing. Instead, the divine assembly must determine whether their grievance is legitimate. Anu asks who instigated the rebellion. The response is telling. Not a single individual, but the collective. All of us gods declared war, they say. The work is too heavy, the toil has become too much. Enlil's initial response is rage. He demands the ringleader be handed over for punishment. But Anu intervenes, and here we see something remarkable in the text. Divine beings engaging in genuine deliberation about justice. Anu asks, essentially, is their complaint valid? And the assembly must admit that it is. The work had become unbearable. The burden had exceeded even divine capacity for endurance. This is the context in which Enki proposes the creation of humanity, not in a vacuum, not as an abstract creative act, as a specific solution to a specific labour crisis. He says in lines 190-197, while the birth goddess is present, let her create offspring, let man assume the drudgery of God. The word translated as drudgery is again dulu, the same word used for the Igigi's unbearable labour. Humans will take on what divine beings could no longer bear. The birth goddess agrees. The god Wi'ila, called Iluela in some versions, is selected for sacrifice, chosen specifically because he possessed Temu, intelligence or reason. His blood is mixed with clay. The goddess Nintu fashions 14 figures, 7 male, 7 female. She recites an incantation as she works, and the text records it. I have undone the fetter, I have provided freedom, I have imposed the basket on man. The burden which the gods carried, I have made man bear. The phrase undone the fetter is startling. The creation of humanity freed the gods from bondage. The implication is clear. The Igigi had been enslaved by their function. The creation of a subordinate category of beings transfers that slavery downward, liberating the gods but binding humanity to the same labour they had found unbearable. Humanity multiplies. The text moves quickly here. 600 years pass in a few lines. Humans spread across the earth. They fulfil their function. The Igigi are free. But what exactly are they free to do? This is where the texts become more fragmentary and require careful reading across multiple sources. The Atrahasis epic focuses primarily on the creation and flood narratives. For details about the Igigi's post-creation role, we must turn to other texts and to comparative analysis of the broader Mesopotamian divine hierarchy. In the Enuma Elish, after Marduk's victory and the organisation of the cosmos, the text describes the assignment of divine duties. Some gods are assigned to heaven, others to earth. Those on earth were responsible for maintaining the temples, receiving sacrifices, and ensuring that human civilization continued to function according to divine plan. This is oversight work, not physical labour. Management rather than execution. Several scholarly analyses of Mesopotamian cosmology note that the Igigi, after humanity's creation, largely disappear from active narrative roles in the myths. They're mentioned as a category. The Igigi and the Anunnaki becomes a stock phrase meaning all the gods, but they rarely act as individuals with names and specific stories. It's as if their collective identity matters more than their individual agency. What we can reconstruct from fragments suggests that the Ajigi transitioned from labourers to supervisors. They were assigned to oversee human activity, to ensure that the work continued, to receive the offerings and sacrifices that fed the divine realm. They became, in essence, middle management, no longer doing the physical work themselves, but responsible for ensuring it got done. This should have been a promotion, a reward for their endurance during the period of divine toil. They had been freed from crushing physical labour and given authority over the newly created humans. In the organisational structure of the cosmos, they had moved up. But here's what the texts preserve. Scattered across different sources and traditions, the Ajigi weren't satisfied with their new role. Or perhaps more accurately, their new role created new problems that the Anunnaki hadn't anticipated. Consider the structural dynamics. The Ajigi had laboured alongside each other, sharing the burden of Dulu, the crushing work that had driven them to rebellion. They knew exhaustion. They understood what it meant to be worked beyond capacity. They had experienced, in their own divine way, something like suffering. Now they were assigned to oversee humans doing essentially the same work they themselves had done. Every canal the humans dug, the Ajigi had once dug. Every temple foundation the humans laid, the Ajigi had once laid. The work hadn't changed. Only the beings performing it had changed. This created a strange kind of proximity. The Ajigi knew what the humans were experiencing because they had experienced it themselves. They understood the exhaustion, the monotony, the sense of being trapped in an endless cycle of maintenance and construction. In the humans, they saw a mirror of their own recent past. Several Neo-Assyrian texts from the first millennium BC describe rituals invoking both Anunnaki and Ajigi, treating them as somewhat interchangeable categories of divine beings to whom offerings must be made. But there's a subtle difference in how they're addressed. The Anunnaki are invoked with language of supreme authority. They are the great gods who decree fate. The Ajigi are invoked with language emphasizing their presence and proximity. They are the gods who watch over humanity, who are near to human affairs. Nearness, proximity, constant contact. These are the conditions that make neutral oversight impossible. The Book of the Watchers, the earliest section of 1 Enoch 6, preserved in Aramaic fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls and complete in the Ethiopian manuscript tradition, describes what happens when heavenly beings are assigned to watch over humanity. The text states explicitly that 200 angels descended to Mount Hermon, taking an oath together to carry out their plan. They were led by a figure called Shemihazar, whose very name in Hebrew carries the meaning of "my name has seen" or "the name sees," a reference to divine observation. But these watchers didn't remain observers. Chapter 6 of 1 Enoch states, when the sons of men had multiplied, in those days beautiful and comely daughters were born to them. And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them. They took human wives. They had children, the Nephilim, the giants, beings of mixed divine human nature who became mighty men but also sources of violence and chaos. The Watchers did something else, something the text treats as equally catastrophic, they taught. Chapter 8 lists the forbidden knowledge they transmitted. Azazel taught humans to make swords, knives, shields and armour, the arts of warfare. Semyaza taught enchantments and root cutting. Armaros taught counter-enchantments. Barakil taught astrology. Kokkabil taught the signs and omens of the stars. Ezekiel taught cloud knowledge. Arakil taught the signs of the earth. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Knowledge, in other words, that was meant to remain divine prerogative. Information that humans weren't supposed to have, not because it was evil in itself, but because it upset the careful balance of the cosmos. Humans with this knowledge could manipulate natural forces, could read divine intentions from celestial patterns, could wage war with divine quality weapons. The boundary between human capacity and divine capacity began to collapse. The mainstream scholarly view of 1 Enoch dates its composition to the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, placing it firmly in the Second Temple period of Judaism. But the text itself preserves older Mesopotamian themes. Several academic studies have noted the parallels between the Watchers and the Igigi, between the teaching role of the fallen angels and the civilization teaching role of the Apkallu, between the mixed nature offspring Fifilin and the composite beings of Mesopotamian iconography. Dr. Amar Anas, in his 2010 comparative study on the origin of Watchers, argues that the Watcher tradition in Jewish apocalyptic literature derives from Mesopotamian mythology of the antediluvian sages. He points out that both the Apkallu and the Watchers are associated with forbidden knowledge, with boundary crossing between divine and human realms, and with events leading to the flood that destroys the corrupted world. The connection isn't speculative or forced. It's well documented through textual, linguistic, and thematic parallels. The Enochic Watchers and the Mesopotamian Igigi Apkallu represent different cultural expressions of the same concept, divine intermediaries whose oversight role proved unstable. But why unstable? What is it about the position of Watcher that contains the seeds of its own failure? The text suggests several interlocking factors. First, proximity breeds attachment. The Igigi/Watchers were placed in constant contact with humanity. They observed human struggles, human creativity, human relationships. Over time, and these texts span centuries or millennia, that observation created connection. The emotional distance necessary for impartial oversight eroded. Second, knowledge is hard to contain. The Igigi possessed divine knowledge because they were divine beings, albeit lesser ones. The Apkallu were explicitly created as wisdom bearers. The Watchers in Enochic tradition possess the secrets of heaven. When beings with knowledge interact constantly with beings without knowledge, the transmission of that knowledge becomes almost inevitable. Teaching happens, whether authorized or not, because knowledge holders naturally explain, demonstrate, answer questions. Third, the intermediary position is inherently unstable. The Igigi were neither supreme gods like the Anunnaki, nor created servants like humans. They occupied a middle position, subordinate above, superior below. This liminal status created identity confusion. Were they enforcers of divine will or advocates for human need? The text suggests they struggled with this question, and their struggle manifested in boundary violations. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the system gave intermediaries responsibility without full authority. The Igigi were responsible for ensuring humans fulfilled their labour obligations, but they couldn't change the fundamental structure that required that labour. They had oversight, but not policy-making power. This created a tension that no amount of divine decree could resolve. The Atrahasis epic, in its flood narrative, makes something clear. The problem wasn't initially that humans failed in their labour. The problem was that they succeeded too well. They multiplied. They became noisy. Tablet 2 describes how the human population grew so large and so boisterous that Enlil couldn't sleep. The uproar of humanity disturbed divine rest. Enlil's solution was escalating catastrophe. First plague, then drought, then famine. Each disaster was meant to reduce the human population to manageable levels, but each time Enki intervened. He instructed humans through intermediaries, sometimes named as the wise Atrahasis himself, sometimes through priests or sages, on how to make specific offerings to specific gods to alleviate the disaster. This is crucial. The intermediaries were subverting divine policy. They were using their position of proximity to humanity to undermine decisions made by the supreme gods. They became advocates rather than overseers, protectors rather than enforcers. Finally, after repeated attempts to reduce the human population failed, Enlil decided on total solution: flood the entire earth, wipe out humanity completely, start over, or simply end the experiment. The divine assembly agreed, or at least didn't stop him, except for Enki. Enki, bound by an oath not to warn humans directly, found a workaround. He spoke to a reed wall, knowing Atrahasis was on the other side, listening. He instructed the building of a boat. He ensured the preservation of human, animal, and plant life. When the flood came, and humanity largely perished, the seed of restoration remained. The flood narrative appears across Near Eastern traditions: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hebrew. The details vary. In some versions, like the Eridu Genesis, the hero is Ziusudra. In the Epic of Gilgamesh League, he's called Utnapishtim. In the Atrahasis, he's Atrahasis himself. In Genesis, Noah. But the pattern is identical: a divine decision to destroy humanity, a righteous man warned by a sympathetic god, a boat, a flood, a remnant preserved. What matters for understanding the Igigi is what the flood represents in structural terms. It's a reset, a system failure so complete that the only solution is to wipe the board clean and reconfigure. The flood destroys not just corrupt humanity, but also the compromised oversight system. The intermediaries who had become advocates, who had taught forbidden knowledge, who had crossed boundaries, they too were eliminated or fundamentally transformed. In the Era Epic, composed much later First Launians, Marduk explicitly states that he sent the Apkallu, the seven sages, back down into the Apps, the subterranean freshwater realm of Enki, as punishment for their role in humanity's corruption. They had been civilization's teachers. Now they were removed from that role. The post-Diluvian world would need a different approach to managing human knowledge and behaviour. The architecture of burden, then, had two phases. First, divine beings bore the burden of physical labour, and that burden became unbearable, leading to rebellion. Second, those same divine beings bore the burden of oversight, and that burden also proved unbearable, not physically, but structurally, because the position itself contained contradictions that couldn't be sustained. You cannot watch without caring. You cannot teach without forming relationships. You cannot exercise authority without eventually questioning that authority's legitimacy. And you cannot occupy a middle position, superior to some, subordinate to others, without experiencing the instability of that position. The texts preserve this pattern not as moral judgment, but as observation. The Igigi weren't evil. The Watchers weren't purely rebellious. They were beings placed in an impossible situation, assigned a role that violated the nature of conscious agents with knowledge, proximity, and partial authority. The Anunnaki's mistake wasn't creating lesser gods. It was believing that those lesser gods could remain neutral overseers indefinitely. That delegation would solve problems rather than transform them. That the boundary between divine and human could be maintained by beings who existed precisely at that boundary. The system failed not because it was poorly executed, but because it was poorly conceived. The architecture of burden had a fatal flaw built into its foundation. It assumed that conscious intermediaries would remain tools of policy rather than becoming agents with their own agendas, attachments, and judgments. And when the system failed, the response was catastrophic, not reform, not adjustment, annihilation. This brings us to a crucial question that the next phase of our investigation must address. If the oversight system failed so dramatically, what replaced it? How did divine knowledge continue to be transmitted to humanity after the flood? And what do the texts tell us about the transition from divine intermediaries to human wisdom keepers? The compromise that changed everything. The decision to create humanity appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, but none describes the process more explicitly than the Atrahasis epic and the myth of Enki and Ninmah. Both texts treat human creation not as a singular moment of divine inspiration, but as a practical solution arrived at through deliberation, negotiation, and even divine experimentation. After the Igi's rebellion, after the burning of tools and the confrontation at Enlil's gate, the divine assembly faced an existential problem. The work, the dulu that maintained the cosmos, still needed to be done. But the beings assigned to do it had proven they would not continue indefinitely. Force them back to labour, and you merely delay another rebellion. Execute them for insubordination, and you eliminate the workforce entirely. Neither option solves the underlying crisis. Enki's proposal represented a third way: create beings specifically designed for the work. Not gods who might resent their function, but something else. Something new. The text of Enki and Ninmah, preserved in multiple fragments and partially reconstructed, describes how Nama, the primeval mother, approaches her son Enki with the problem. The version from the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, based on tablets from Nippur and Ula, records Enki's response: Mother, the being you have mentioned exists. Impose the work of the gods on it. Let man fashion clay from the Abzu, the fresh underground waters where Enki lives, and let the Abzu be the source of the material from which humans are formed. The choice of material matters. Clay from the Abzu, Enki's realm, the source of fresh water, wisdom and creative power, mixed with divine blood. Not purely earthly material, but earthly substance, animated by divine essence. Humans would be hybrids from the start, composed of both realms, belonging fully to neither. The Atrahasis version provides more detail about the divine component. Ila, sometimes called Geshtu-E invariance, is selected for sacrifice. The text specifies why he had Temu, intelligence or understanding. His blood, containing this quality, is mixed with clay. Nintu takes over the creation process, kneading the mixture while reciting incantations. She forms 14 figures, 7 males, 7 females, and places them in a special chamber to develop for a specified period. This isn't instantaneous creation through divine word, as in some other traditions. It's more like gestation, requiring time and process. When the figures are complete, Nintu recites the key declaration we've already noted: I have removed your heavy work, I have imposed your toil on man. The transfer is complete. Humans inherit the burden that gods could not sustain. But here the texts reveal something that mainstream scholarship sometimes glosses over in favour of focusing on the flood narrative. The newly created humans required extensive instruction. They didn't emerge knowing agriculture, architecture, ritual or law. That knowledge had to be transmitted, and the question of who would transmit it and how becomes the critical hinge point for everything that follows. The texts offer multiple answers, which suggests this was a question ancient peoples themselves debated and reconsidered across generations. One tradition, preserved primarily in Babylonian sources and transmitted through the writings of Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek in the 3rd century B, emphasizes the Apkallu, the 7 sages. According to Berossus, a being named Oannes emerged from the Persian Gulf during the reign of the first king. Oannes was described as amphibious, having the body of a fish, but beneath it the form of a man. During the day, he taught humans letters and sciences and arts. At night, he returned to the sea. Berossus lists 7 such beings, each associated with a different antediluvian king, each teaching additional aspects of civilization. The cuneiform sources provide related but distinct information. Several text fragments list the 7 sages by name: Adapa or Unidupa, Uanidupa, Emmeduga, Emmegalana, Emmebuluga, Aninlilda, and Utuabzu. They are associated with the first 7 cities of Sumer, Eridu, Ur-Nippur, Kulab, Kesh, Lagash, and Shuruppak. Each sage advised the king of his respective city, teaching the arts of civilization and the proper maintenance of temples and rituals. The Apkallu represent authorized transmission. They were created by Enki specifically for the purpose of instructing humanity. They possessed divine wisdom, but operated under divine mandate. They were intermediaries, yes, but carefully designed ones, limited in number 7, associated with specific locations, the first cities. and operating during a defined historical period before the... This was supposed to be the controlled version of knowledge transmission, not the chaotic teaching of the Fallen Watchers, but structured, authorized, purposeful education under divine supervision. Except the texts also preserve hints that even this authorized transmission was problematic. The Adapa myth, which we've mentioned but haven't yet fully examined, reveals the tension. Adapa, the first of the sages, was created by Enki with vast wisdom. He knew the plans of the land. He possessed understanding. He served as a sage in Eridu. But crucially, Enki did not give him immortality. The story preserved in fragments from Amarna and Nineveh tells how Adapa, while fishing on behalf of Eridu's temple, was capsized by the south wind. In rage, he broke the south wind's wing, causing it to cease blowing for 7 days. This drew the attention of Anu, the supreme heaven god, who summoned Adapa to the highest heaven to answer for his action. Enki warned Adapa that when he reached Anu's presence, he would be offered the food and water of death, a test of mortality. Enki instructed him to refuse both. But when Adapa arrived and explained his actions, Anu was impressed by his wisdom. Deciding to grant immortality to this exceptional human, Anu instead offered him the food and water of life. Following Enki's instruction, Adapa refused. Too late, he realized the deception. Or was it deception? Scholars debate whether Enki deliberately tricked Adapa or genuinely believed Anu would offer death. Either way, the result stands: humanity's wisest representative, granted an audience with the highest god, refused the gift of immortality because his divine creator had told him to. The opportunity to transcend human limitation was lost through obedience to divine instruction. The myth operates on multiple levels. As narrative, it explains why humans, despite possessing divine wisdom through Adapa's teaching, remain mortal. As theology, it explores the limits of Enki's authority. He could grant wisdom, but not eternal life, which remained Anu's prerogative. But as a meditation on the intermediary problem, it reveals something critical. Even authorized knowledge transmission creates complications. Adapa possessed wisdom that made him capable of impressing Anu himself. He had knowledge that elevated him above ordinary humanity. He was, in essence, a being who existed between categories, not fully human despite his mortality, not fully divine despite his wisdom. The Apkallu, collectively, occupied this same liminal space. And liminal beings, as we've seen with the Igigi, tend to be unstable. They exist at boundaries. They possess qualities of both sides. They become pressure points where systems fail. Another angle emerges from the Era epic, a late Babylonian text from the 1st millennium BCE. In this poem, the god Erug-and-War-Diet deceives Marduk into temporarily leaving his throne in Babylon. During Marduk's absence, Erug causes widespread destruction. When Marduk returns and surveys the damage, he laments multiple losses. Among them, he notes that the Apkallu, the pure Puradu fish, the wise counsellors, are no longer present. He had sent them down into the Apps, back to Enki's subterranean realm. This happened, according to the text, as a consequence of the flood. The Apkallu, who had transmitted civilization's knowledge in the antediluvian age, were removed from their role afterward. The implication is that they had somehow failed in their function, or that their presence had contributed to the corruption that necessitated the flood in the first place. If the Apkallu were removed, who transmitted knowledge in the post-diluvian world? The text suggests that humans themselves took over this function. After the flood, in both Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, knowledge is passed down through human lineages, from king to king, from priest to priest, from sage to sage. The intermediary beings disappear or retreat into the background. Humans become responsible for maintaining and transmitting civilization's knowledge without direct divine tutors. This transition marks a fundamental shift in the cosmic order. Before the flood, humans were recipients of knowledge from divine intermediaries. After the flood, humans became the preservers and transmitters of knowledge themselves. The system moved from vertical transmission, Vi, to human, to horizontal transmission, to human. The Sumerian king list reflects this transition. The antediluvian kings, listed before the flood, have impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. These numbers, whether understood literally, symbolically, or as computational artifacts of different calendar systems, mark those rulers as existing in a different order of time. They lived when the Apkallu were present, when direct divine instruction was available, when the boundary between divine and human was more permeable. After the flood, the king list's reigns become progressively shorter, starting at still superhuman lengths, 1200 years for some early post-diluvian rulers. They gradually decrease until reaching historically plausible numbers in the later dynasties. The progression suggests a gradual normalization, a slow withdrawal of direct divine presence and intervention. The archaeological record provides interesting context here. The cities listed in the king list, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, correspond to actual sites with confirmed occupation layers. The flood narrative in multiple texts states that kingship descended from heaven before the deluge, was interrupted by the deluge, and then descended again afterward in the city of Kish. Excavations at Ur, Uruk, Shuruppak and Kish have revealed flood layers, strata of water deposited sediment interrupting the archaeological sequence. Not evidence of a global flood covering all mountains, but clear indication of catastrophic local flooding that would have devastated Mesopotamian civilization. Whether these archaeological flood layers correspond to the mythic flood event is debated, but the fact of devastating floods in Mesopotamian history is not. What matters for our investigation is what the flood represents structurally, the end of one system and the beginning of another. The compromise that changed everything, creating humans to replace divine labourers, proved successful in its immediate goal, but created new problems that ultimately required their own catastrophic solution. The pattern can be stated simply: the Anunnaki created humans to solve the labour problem. Humans required oversight and instruction. The Anunnaki appointed intermediaries, Ijiji, Akalu, to provide that oversight and instruction. The intermediaries became attached to humans, taught forbidden knowledge, crossed boundaries. The system collapsed. The flood reset the system. Afterward, a new arrangement emerged with direct divine intermediaries largely removed. But was the new system stable, or did it simply defer the same problems to a different level? The texts suggest that post-diluvian humanity continued to struggle with questions of legitimate authority, proper knowledge, and the boundary between human capacity and divine prerogative. The flood solved the immediate crisis of corrupted intermediaries, but it didn't solve the underlying question: how much knowledge should humans have? Who decides what's forbidden? And what happens when humans, through their own ingenuity or through unauthorized transmission, acquire knowledge that destabilizes the cosmic order? We find hints of these ongoing tensions in multiple post-diluvian narratives. The myth of Immerkar and the Lord of Aratta, which we'll examine in more detail later, contains a passage about the confusion of languages, a divine intervention that limited human capacity for collective action and thus reduced the threat they posed to cosmic stability. The Adad Gupi inscription from the 6th century BC mentions humans who changed the appearance of the gods, suggesting ongoing anxiety about whether humans were properly maintaining divine human boundaries. The shift from divine intermediaries to human knowledge keepers represented a compromise, not a solution. It acknowledged that the previous system failed while leaving unresolved the fundamental problem. Conscious beings with knowledge will use that knowledge, will transmit that knowledge, and will inevitably exceed the boundaries originally set for them. The Anunnaki's fatal mistake, then, wasn't just creating intermediaries. It was believing that any system of delegated oversight could remain stable indefinitely, that boundaries, once established, would hold, that knowledge, once categorized as forbidden or permitted, would stay within those categories. The texts preserve what happened when those beliefs proved false. They record, in remarkable detail, how multiple oversight systems were tried, and how each failed in its own way. The Igigi rebelled from exhaustion and then became problematically attached when given oversight roles. The Apkallu transmitted too much knowledge or failed to prevent corruption. Human kings and priests, inheriting the role of knowledge keepers, proved no more stable than their divine predecessors. This persistent instability across multiple iterations of divine human governance suggests something deeper than mythology. It suggests that ancient peoples were grappling with real questions about authority, knowledge, and the limits of control. Questions that remain relevant because they're built into the structure of hierarchical systems themselves. Before we explore how the unauthorized knowledge transmission unfolded and what specific teachings the texts identify as dangerous, we need to look more closely at the 7 sages themselves. Who were they, really? What did their composite nature, part human, part fish, part bird, signify? And why does their story appear across such a wide geographical and temporal range, from 3rd millennium Sumerian texts to 1st millennium Hebrew apocalyptic literature? 7 sages, 7 cities. The number 7 appears with striking frequency in Mesopotamian religious texts. 7 gods decree fate. 7 demons bring plague. 7 gates lead to the underworld. 7 tablets contain the epic of creation. And 7 sages bring civilization's arts to humanity during the time before the flood. The number's significance likely relates to astronomical observation. 7 visible celestial bodies, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, whose movements structured the Mesopotamian calendar and cosmology. 7 represented completeness, a full set, a cycle concluded. When texts speak of 7 sages, they're indicating not a random number, but a complete system, all the wisdom bearers, the entire authorized intermediary class. The cuneiform sources that list the Apkallu by name come from several different contexts. One appears in a text from Uruk, cataloguing ritual instructions for protecting buildings from evil spirits. Another comes from a Seleucid-era tablet from Babylon, preserving ancient traditions. The names vary slightly between sources, and their etymologies offer clues to their functions. Adapa, whose name might derive from Abba or relate to Akkadian Adapu, stands first in every list. He's explicitly associated with Eridu, the earliest city in Sumerian tradition. His role as sage to Alulim, the first antediluvian king, establishes the pattern. Each city receives a sage, each sage advises a king, and through this paired system, divine wisdom guiding human authority, civilization emerges and stabilizes. The archaeological site of Eridu, modern Tel Abu Sharain, reveals occupation from the Ubaid period, 5400–4000 Nark, continuing through the early dynastic period. Excavations uncovered a sequence of temples built atop one another, each iteration expanding on the previous. The earliest temple, dating to approximately 5000 BC, was a small single-room structure. By 4000 BC, the temple complex covered significant area with multiple rooms, courtyards, and elaborate architectural features. This physical evidence suggests something happened at Eridu, some transformation from scattered settlement to organised urban centre with monumental religious architecture. The texts attribute this transformation to divine instruction transmitted through Adapa. Mainstream archaeology attributes it to the gradual accumulation of agricultural surplus, population growth, and the development of specialized labor. But these explanations aren't mutually exclusive if we understand divine instruction as the crystallization of practical knowledge into teachable systems. The second sage, Uwan-Nidupa, or Unak, was associated with Larak. The name might mean man plus a term for good or pure. Less is known about him compared to Adapa, but his inclusion in the list indicates that the pattern extended beyond Eridu. Each of the early cities received its own sage advisor. Enmeduga, the third sage, served in Sipar, the city sacred to Shamash the sun god. His name contains the element Mi, which in Sumerian refers to divine powers or cultural fundamentals, the building blocks of civilization. The Mi were conceptualized as portable, transferable essences that could be stolen or given. Inanna's descent to the underworld and her journey to Eridu involve attempting to acquire Mi from Enki. That this sage's name contains Mi suggests he was particularly associated with transmitting these cultural fundamentals. The pattern continues through all seven: Emmi Galana, Emmi Buluga, Luga, Anenlilda, and Utu-Abzu. Each name, each city, each paired king-sage relationship represents a node in the network through which civilization's knowledge supposedly flowed from divine source to human application. But knowledge of what? Specifically, the texts provide details. Berossus, writing much later, but drawing on Babylonian temple archives, described Oannes, his Greek rendering of Uan or Adape, teaching humans letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them how to build cities and temples, how to compile laws, how to understand geometry and mathematics. He showed them how to plant seeds and gather crops. He instructed them in everything that tends to soften manners and humanize their lives. The phrase soften manners and humanize is revealing. It suggests that pre-civilized humans, despite being created with divine intelligence, were still rough, unformed, unorganized. The knowledge the Apkallu transmitted wasn't just technical, how to build or plant, but cultural, how to organize society, how to relate to each other, how to create systems of law and justice. Cuneiform texts attributed to the Apkallu include medical knowledge, astronomical observations, architectural principles, and ritual procedures. Several building inscriptions from later periods claim to follow plans established by the antediluvian sages, giving their instructions a timeless authority. If the Apkallu designed it, the logic goes, it must be correct, because they possessed divine wisdom. The sages were also credited with creating the first writing system. Some traditions suggest Adapa invented cuneiform script itself, though historical linguistics traces cuneiform's development over several centuries. But the association of writing with the Apkallu makes symbolic sense. Writing transforms oral knowledge into permanent, transportable, teachable form. It separates knowledge from the knower, allowing transmission across time and space. If the sage's function was to transmit divine knowledge to humans, writing would be their essential technology. Archaeological evidence shows that writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, first as pictographic accounting tokens and gradually developing into the wedge-shaped cuneiform system capable of representing complex language. The earliest tablets record economic transactions, grain allotments, livestock counts, land distributions, not mythology or theology, but the practical knowledge needed to manage urban civilization. This matches what the texts say about the Apkallu's teaching. They brought organizational knowledge, the systems and structures that allow complex society to function. Temple architecture, yes, but also canal design, irrigation management, crop rotation, textile production, metalworking, pottery techniques, the accumulated wisdom that transforms scattered settlements into cities. From a certain perspective, this knowledge transmission was humanity's greatest gift. The Apkallu took beings designed merely to labour and taught them how to create, organise and flourish. They elevated humans from tool users to culture builders. But from another perspective, the one the flood narratives ultimately endorse, this knowledge transmission was dangerous. It gave humans capacity beyond what their creation intended. It made them powerful enough to disturb divine rest with their uproar, capable enough to threaten cosmic stability, knowledgeable enough to challenge divine prerogative. The texts preserve this tension without fully resolving it. Were the Apkallu beneficial or dangerous? Did they fulfill their function or exceed it? The answer seems to depend on perspective and outcome. What's most striking is the composite iconography associated with the Apkallu in Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs. These images, carved into stone to protect buildings and invoke divine blessing, show the sages with human bodies, but fish skins draped over them like cloaks, complete with fish heads above their human heads. Other depictions show them with bird-like features, or entirely as bird-headed humanoids. These aren't realistic depictions. They're symbolic representations emphasizing the sage's liminal nature. The fish element likely connects them to the Apps, Enki's subterranean freshwater realm, emphasizing their origin in divine wisdom. The bird element suggests their capacity to move between earth and heaven, between human and divine realms. They are boundary crossers by nature, beings who exist between categories. In Mesopotamian thinking, boundaries were crucial. The cosmos was organized through separation, heaven from earth, fresh water from salt water, divine from human, civilized from wild. Most beings belonged clearly to one side of these boundaries or the other. But certain beings, the Apkallu, the Igigi in their oversight role, later the Watchers in Hebrew tradition, were defined by their ability to cross boundaries. This made them uniquely valuable and uniquely dangerous. Valuable because they could bring knowledge across the divine-human boundary that would otherwise remain separate. Dangerous because beings accustomed to crossing one boundary might cross others that should remain inviolate. Several scholarly studies have examined the connection between the Mesopotamian Apkallu and the Hebrew Watchers. Dr. Helgi Kvanvig's work on the lists of the 7 Apkallu notes that both traditions describe 7 primary figures associated with forbidden knowledge transmission. Both associate these figures with the time before the flood. Both present their teaching as having ambiguous consequences, beneficial in content, but destabilizing in effect. The Book of Watchers in 1 Enoch explicitly presents 200 angels who descended to Mount Hermon, but it also mentions the chiefs of tens and other organizational structures, suggesting a more limited number of primary leaders. Several scholars have noted that the specific names of Watcher leaders in Enochic literature, Shemihaza, Azazel, Amaros, Barakel, Kokabel, Ezekiel, Arakiel, Shamsiel, number roughly 7 primary figures with others as followers. The parallel extends to function. Both the Apkallu and the Watchers teach. Both transmit knowledge from divine source to human recipients. Both create problems through their teaching that ultimately require divine intervention to resolve. But there's a crucial difference in how the traditions evaluate this teaching. The Mesopotamian sources treat the Apkallu ambivalently. They brought necessary civilization, but perhaps went too far. The Enochic tradition treats the Watchers more harshly. Their teaching was explicitly forbidden. Their descent was rebellion. Their punishment was eternal imprisonment. This difference likely reflects the distinct theological concerns of each tradition. Mesopotamian religion sought to explain the origins of civilization and justify the current social order with its temple systems, priestly classes, and royal authority. The Apkallu's teaching explained why humans had these institutions and gave them divine legitimacy. The sages brought what humans now possessed. Jewish apocalyptic literature, developing during periods of foreign domination and religious persecution, was more concerned with explaining evil, suffering, and the apparent absence of direct divine intervention. The Watcher's teaching explained where forbidden knowledge came from, why the world was corrupt, and why humanity suffered. It was because divine intermediaries had violated their mandate, teaching things humans weren't meant to know, creating mixed-nature offspring that spread violence. Despite their different evaluative frameworks, both traditions preserve the same essential pattern: divine intermediaries assigned to instruct or oversee humanity exceeded their mandate, crossing boundaries that should have remained firm, transmitting knowledge that destabilized the cosmic order. The 7 cities associated with the 7 sages offer another angle for analysis. Eridu, Larak, Sippar, Bad Tabira, Kulab, Kesh and Shuruppak weren't random settlements. They represented the earliest urban centres in southern Mesopotamia, the sites where agricultural villages transformed into something larger and more complex. Each city had its patron deity: Enki in Eridu, Shamash in Sippar, Dumuzi in Bad Tabira, and so forth. Each city claimed ancient foundation, tracing its origins to the beginning of time, and each city, according to the texts, received its sage from Enki. This creates an interesting pattern. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, personally created all 7 sages. He was their source, their authority, their divine patron. When they taught humans, they transmitted Enki's knowledge. When they advised kings, they channeled Enki's wisdom. But Enki was not the supreme god. That position belonged to an Anu, or, in later Babylonian theology, to Enlil or Marduk. Enki was powerful but subordinate, clever but not ultimately authoritative, the trickster god who found workarounds rather than confronting problems directly. When the Apkallu acted, they acted under Enki's authorization, not the divine assembly's full consensus. This matters because it suggests the sages represented not neutral divine policy, but specifically Enki's agenda, which often conflicted with other gods, particularly Enlil. The clearest example appears in every flood narrative. Enlil decides to destroy humanity. The divine assembly agrees, or at least doesn't object. But Enki subverts the decision, warning the flood hero and ensuring humanity's survival. In some versions, he warns directly. In others, he warns through an intermediary, a sage, a priest, a dream. The Apkallu, as Enki's creations, naturally align with his interests. This complicates the narrative significantly. The sages weren't neutral transmitters of objective divine will. They were agents of a particular divine faction within a larger divine politics. Their teachings served Enki's agenda, which favoured humanity's development even when other gods preferred human limitation. From this angle, the fatal mistake wasn't just creating intermediaries. It was allowing one god's intermediaries to function without adequate oversight from the broader divine assembly. Enki created his sages, sent them to teach humans, and used them to advance his own agenda, preserving and developing humanity despite other gods' concerns that humans were becoming too numerous, too noisy, too capable. The Era epic statement that Marduk sent the Apkallu down into the Apps after the flood suggests this very problem. The sages had to be removed, not because they were corrupting themselves, but because they represented Enki's unilateral intervention in divine human relations. After the flood, a new system would emerge, one where human kings and priests, not divine sages, would mediate between heaven and earth. But before that new system could stabilise, the old system had to fail completely. And the texts preserve exactly how that failure unfolded, through the gradual erosion of boundaries, the transmission of forbidden knowledge, and the creation of hybrid beings who belonged to neither category and thus destabilised both. The 7 sages and 7 cities represent the infrastructure of the original knowledge transmission system, a carefully organised network of divine human interface points. The structure appeared sound. The theory was elegant. Each sage taught his city. Each city maintained its traditions. Knowledge flowed in controlled channels from divine source, through authorized intermediaries to human recipients. But controlled channels, once established, can be used for unauthorized flows, and authorized intermediaries, over time, develop their own relationship with those they're meant to merely instruct. The sages were designed to be bridges. Bridges permit crossing in both directions, and the texts preserve what happened when crossing became not transmission but transgression. The Watchers in parallel traditions. The Book of Watchers, the first section of 1 Enoch, comprising chapters 1 through 36, exists in fragments. Aramaic portions were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, particularly in Cave 4, dating to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The complete text survives only in the Ethiopian manuscript tradition preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which considers 1 Enoch canonical scripture. The text composition is generally dated to the 3rd or 2nd century BC, placing it squarely in the Second Temple period of Judaism. But the traditions it preserves, the stories about the Watchers, their descent, their teaching, their punishment, almost certainly draw on older Near Eastern sources. The parallels with Mesopotamian material are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. Chapter 6 begins the narrative, and it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. 200 angels, the text specifies, descended to Mount Hermon. They bound themselves by oath. The mutual accountability of conspirators who know their action violates divine law. Their leader, Shemihazar, feared he alone would bear the blame for the crime, so he required all 200 to swear together that they would carry out their plan. Mount Hermon sits at the northern border of ancient Israel at the southern end of the anti-Lebanon mountain range. Its peak exceeds 9,000 feet. In clear weather, it's visible from extraordinary distances, from the Mediterranean coast, from the Sea of Galilee, from Damascus. Choosing Hermon as the descent point places the Watchers at a liminal space, the boundary between territory controlled by different peoples, a mountain that touches heaven, a place apart from ordinary human settlement. The oath they swear is called, in the text, mutual imprecations. They curse themselves if they fail to follow through. This isn't casual rebellion, it's calculated, planned, binding. They know they're violating their mandate. They do it anyway, and they bind each other to shared culpability. The text lists the names of the 20 leaders: Shemihazar, Arakel, Ramel, Kokabel, Tamel, Ramel, Daniel, Ezekiel, Barakel, Asael, Amaros, Betariel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapil, Satariel, Churiel, Umiel, and Araziel. The names are theophoric. Many contain El, the Hebrew name for God. Shemihazar contains Shem and Hazar to see, suggesting the name sees or God has seen. Barakiel contains Barak plus El. These are divine beings, angels, members of the heavenly host. Their names mark them as such. They descend. They take wives from among human women. The women conceive and bear children. The Nephilim, the giants, beings of mixed divine human nature. The text describes these giants as 300 cubits tall, though scholars debate whether this is textual corruption or symbolic exaggeration. What's clear is that they're powerful, voracious, violent. They consume humanity's food supplies. When those run out, they turn on humans themselves. They devour flesh. They drink blood. They create chaos and terror. But the physical mixing, angels with humans, is only part of the violation. Chapter 8 describes the knowledge transmission, and Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all colouring tinctures, warfare technology, metallurgy, cosmetics, precious stones and dyes. The domestication of Earth's raw materials into products of culture and conflict. Things that didn't exist before are now introduced through Azazel's teaching. The text continues, "And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways." The teaching corrupted humanity, not because the knowledge was evil in itself. There's nothing inherently wrong with knowing how to work metal or make dye, but because humans weren't ready for it. They lacked the wisdom to use knowledge responsibly. Given advanced technology and practical arts, they turned them toward violence and vanity. The other Watchers taught additional knowledge. Shemihaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, magic and botanical medicine. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments, counter magic. Barakil taught astrology. Cockabill taught the signs and omens of the stars. Ezekiel taught meteorology, understanding clouds and weather. Arakil taught the signs of the earth, perhaps geomancy or geology. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, solar observation and calendar calculation. Read one way, this is the origin story of science. Astronomy, meteorology, geology, botany, medicine. The Watchers taught humans to observe natural phenomena, recognize patterns, make predictions. They taught the empirical method before it had a name. Read another way, this is the origin story of forbidden knowledge. Divine prerogative includes understanding celestial signs, weather patterns, the deeper forces governing reality. Humans have their domain, the earth, agriculture, simple crafts. When they're taught to read the stars, predict the future from omens, manipulate natural forces through enchantment, they cross into divine territory. They acquire power beyond their created purpose. The text itself presents the teaching as transgression. Chapter 9 describes how the righteous who remained uncoached by the Watchers cry out to heaven about the blood shed on earth. Their prayer reaches the throne, and 4 archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, bring the complaint before God. God's response is comprehensive judgment. To Uriel, "Go to Noah, and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, and instruct him that he may escape, and his seed may be preserved for all the generations of the world. The flood is coming, a remnant will be preserved." To Raphael, bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudail, and cast him there. Place upon him rough and jagged rocks, and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face, that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire. To Gabriel, proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and destroy the children of the Watchers from amongst men. Send them one against the other, that they may destroy each other in battle. To Michael, go bind Shemihaza and his associates, who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, until the day of their judgment. The punishment is multifaceted. The Nephilim will destroy each other. The Watchers will be imprisoned underground, bound in darkness, separated from the world they corrupted. On a final day of judgment, they'll be thrown into eternal fire. The system doesn't get reformed. It gets eliminated and replaced. The parallels with Mesopotamian traditions are striking. Both feature divine beings assigned some relationship with humanity who cross boundaries, teach forbidden knowledge, and face catastrophic judgment. Both place these events before the flood. Both present the flood as divine response to corruption caused by the boundary violation. Both suggest that mixed nature offspring, Nephilim in Hebrew tradition, various divine human hybrids in Mesopotamian texts, create special problems that ordinary humans don't. But There are also important differences. The Mesopotamian Igigi rebel against divine authority before humanity's creation, and their rebellion leads to humanity's creation as a solution. The Watchers in Enochic tradition descend after humanity exists, and their interaction with humans creates the problem requiring the flood solution. The Mesopotamian Apkallu are authorized teachers, created by Enki for the specific purpose of instructing humanity. The Watchers in 1 Enoch are unauthorized teachers, violating their mandate as observers to become participants and instructors. These differences might reflect the different theological contexts. Mesopotamian tradition needed to explain the origin of civilization's knowledge. Where did humans learn agriculture, architecture, writing, ritual? The Apkallu provide the answer. Gods deliberately taught us. Jewish apocalyptic tradition needed to explain the origin of evil and suffering. Why is the world corrupt? Why do humans know things that lead to violence? The Watchers provide the answer. Rebellious angels taught us things we weren't meant to know. Despite these differences, several scholars have argued for direct literary and conceptual dependence. The composite iconography of the Apkallu, fish-cloaked, bird-headed, liminal beings, finds conceptual parallel in the Watchers' descent from heaven to earth, their existence between categories. The 7 primary Apkallu match, roughly with the 7 to 20 leaders among the Watchers, depending on how you count. The specific types of knowledge transmitted, astronomy, divination, metalworking, medicine, overlap significantly between traditions. Dr. Amar Annis's study on the origin of Watchers argues that the Enochic Watchers derive directly from Mesopotamian traditions about the Apkallu and Igigi. He points to linguistic parallels. The Aramaic word used for Watchers, Irin or Irim, may relate to earlier Mesopotamian terminology for divine beings assigned to Earth. He notes that in both traditions, these beings are associated with specialized knowledge, with the time before the flood, and with events that required divine intervention to correct. The question becomes, are these independent mythologies that happen to address similar concerns about divine human boundaries, or is the Enochic tradition deliberately appropriating and reinterpreting older Mesopotamian material? The evidence suggests the latter. Jewish communities during the Babylonian exile and beyond had extensive contact with Mesopotamian culture. They lived in the same cities, worked with Babylonian texts, participated in the same economic and political systems. Cuneiform texts were still being written and read well into the 1st century BC. The transmission of Mesopotamian traditions into Jewish apocalyptic literature wasn't theft or confusion, it was cultural engagement, reinterpreting older stories to serve new theological purposes. What's remarkable is not that the traditions differ, but that they're so similar despite their different theological frameworks. This suggests that both are grappling with the same fundamental problem, a problem rooted not in specific cultural context, but in the structure of delegated oversight itself. Consider what both traditions agree on. Divine beings assigned to watch over or instruct humanity cannot remain neutral indefinitely. Proximity breeds attachment. Knowledge wants to be shared. Boundaries, once established, become sites of tension and eventual transgression. And when the transgression occurs, the response must be catastrophic, not adjustment or reform, but elimination and reset. This pattern appears too consistently to be accidental. The Sumerian texts about the Igigi's rebellion, the Babylonian texts about the Apkallu's removal, the Hebrew texts about the Watchers' fall and imprisonment all preserve the same essential narrative. Delegated oversight fails because overseers become participants. The texts even agree on why the knowledge transmission was dangerous. It wasn't that humans misused the knowledge, though some texts emphasize that. It was that humans having the knowledge disrupted cosmic order. Knowing how to read celestial signs gave humans the capacity to predict divine actions. Knowing metallurgy gave them weapons that made them dangerous. Knowing enchantments gave them access to forces beyond their created limitations. In both Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions, there's a clear sense that the cosmos functions through maintained boundaries: heaven and earth, divine and human, knowledge that belongs to gods and knowledge that belongs to humans. When these boundaries are violated, when beings cross between categories, when knowledge flows across forbidden channels, the result is chaos requiring divine intervention to restore order. The Watchers in Enochic tradition and the Igigi/Apkallu in Mesopotamian tradition represent different cultural expressions of the same conceptual problem. Both are intermediary beings, neither fully among the highest gods nor fully separate from humanity. Both possess knowledge that they transmit, authorized or not. Both demonstrate that the intermediary position is inherently unstable because it requires beings to maintain boundaries they are uniquely positioned to cross. This brings us to a question the texts themselves seem to struggle with. Is the knowledge itself dangerous, or is it the unauthorized transmission that creates the problem? Could the same knowledge be safely given if properly authorized and controlled? Or does the very act of humans possessing certain knowledge destabilize the cosmic order regardless of how they acquire it? The answer, suggested by multiple texts, seems to be that it's both. The knowledge is dangerous because it changes human capacity in ways that disrupt the original design. A human who can read the stars isn't the same as a human who can only till fields. A human with enchantments isn't the same as a human with only physical tools. The transformation of human capability transforms the cosmic order, but the unauthorized transmission makes it worse because it demonstrates that divine control over knowledge is not absolute. If intermediaries can violate their mandate and teach what shouldn't be taught, then the system has failed. The boundaries aren't being maintained. And if boundaries aren't maintained, chaos, the primordial disorder that divine action organized into cosmos, threatens to return. The next phase of our investigation must examine specific examples of this knowledge transmission and why certain teachings were treated as particularly catastrophic. What exactly did the text consider forbidden knowledge? And what made it forbidden? Its content or its recipients? Adappa's refusal. Among all the texts preserved from ancient Mesopotamia, few are more puzzling or more revealing than the myth of Adappa. The story survives in fragments, one from the archive at Tel El Amarna in Egypt 14th century, others from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh 7th century. Despite gaps and damaged sections, the narrative's outline is clear and its implications profound. Adappa was called the Sage of Eridu, the first of the 7 Apkallu created by Enki. The text describes him using remarkable language, wide of understanding. He perfected wisdom, his command like the command of Anu. He possessed intelligence that approached divine status. Enki had given him wisdom to show the design of the land, meaning Adappa understood the cosmic order, the patterns governing reality. But Enki did not give him eternal life. This distinction matters. Adappa had divine wisdom without divine immortality, knowledge without permanence. He could understand the gods' plans, but remained subject to death. The text is explicit. Enki made broad understanding perfect in him to disclose the design of the land. To him he gave wisdom, eternal life he did not give to him. Why? The text doesn't explain the reasoning, which suggests the original audience understood it as obvious. A being with divine wisdom and divine immortality would be, functionally, a god. The Apkallu were meant to be intermediaries, not equals. They could possess wisdom to transmit to humans, but they couldn't possess the full attributes of divinity. That would eliminate the boundary their very existence was meant to maintain. The story begins with Adappa fishing. He operated a boat for Eridu's temple, providing fish for the divine offerings. This detail matters. Adapa wasn't fishing for himself, but performing ritual service. He was carrying out proper function when the incident occurred. While Adapa fished, the south wind rose and capsized his boat, throwing him into the water. In rage, and here the text emphasizes his emotional response, Adapa broke the south wind's wing. The Akkadian says he broke its wing, treating the wind as a bird. For 7 days afterward, the south wind did not blow. The cessation of the south wind drew Anu's attention. The text describes Anu, the supreme heaven god, noticing the absence of this elemental force and inquiring about what happened. His minister Ilabrat investigated and reported Adapa, the son of Ea, has broken the wing of the south wind. Anu's response is notable. He doesn't immediately rage or punish. He summons Adapa to heaven to give account. This is potentially an honour, a human or sage granted audience with the highest god. It's also potentially a trap. Divine summons could mean judgment and execution. Enki, learning of the summons, provides Adapa with instructions. He tells Adapa what to expect when he reaches heaven's gate. 2 gods, Tammuz and Gishzida, will be stationed there. They're in mourning, so Adapa should appear mourning as well, wearing a mourning garment with dishevelled hair. When they ask why he mourns, he should say, 2 gods have vanished from our land, therefore I am thus. When they ask which gods, he should name Tammuz and Gishzida themselves. This is clever instruction. By mourning for the gods he's about to meet, Adapa shows he honours them and grieves their absence from earth. When they discover they're the ones he mourns, they'll be pleased and become his advocates before Anu. The strategy works. Tammuz and Gishzida speak favourably of Adapa to Anu, describing his actions and his demonstration of proper respect. But then Enki gives Adapa the crucial warning: when you stand before Anu, they will offer you bread of death, do not eat. They will offer you water of death, do not drink. They will offer you a garment, put it on. They will offer oil, anoint yourself. Adapa follows the first part of Enki's instruction perfectly. He appears before Anu properly mourning, gains the advocacy of the gatekeepers, and stands before the supreme god. Anu questions him about breaking the south wind's wing. Adapa explains, he was fishing for his temple's offerings when the wind capsized his boat and drenched him, so he broke its wing in anger. Anu's response suggests he's impressed rather than angry. A human sage who could affect an elemental force, breaking the very wind, demonstrates extraordinary power. Anu turns to Tammuz and Gishzida, who speak well of Adapa, and then Anu makes a remarkable decision. He has come up to us from the lower earth. We will give him the food of life that he might eat. Food of life, not food of death. Water of life, not water of death. Anu, impressed by Adapa's wisdom and power, decides to grant him immortality, to raise this sage from mortal to divine status. But Adapa, following Enki's instruction, refuses. He won't eat, he won't drink. Following his father's command exactly, he rejects what's offered. The text records Anu's reaction with poignant simplicity. Why, Adapa, did you neither eat nor drink? You will not have eternal life. Ah, what has Ea done? Why did he speak thus to his child? Why did he make him wise? Too late, Adapa realizes what he's refused. The opportunity for immortality, offered by the highest god, is lost because he obeyed Enki's warning about death food. Anu orders him return to earth. The text breaks off, but the implication is clear. Adapa remains mortal despite his divine wisdom. The first sage, who possessed knowledge comparable to the gods, was denied the one attribute, eternal life, that would have made him their equal. The story operates on multiple levels. As mythology, it explains why humans remain mortal despite possessing wisdom. Even the wisest human, granted audience with the supreme god, couldn't overcome death. As theology, it explores the relationship between knowledge and life, between wisdom and immortality, suggesting these are separate attributes that don't necessarily come together. But as a meditation on intermediaries and oversight, the Adapa myth reveals something crucial about the system's design, the fatal flaw was built in from the beginning. Adapa was created with divine wisdom specifically so he could instruct humans. Enki gave him understanding of the design of the land, the cosmic order, the patterns, the deep knowledge necessary for civilization. Without this wisdom, Adapa couldn't perform his function as sage and teacher. The knowledge was necessary for his role. But Enki explicitly withheld immortality. Adapa would age and die like any human. His knowledge would be lost unless transmitted to successors. And here's the structural problem. Beings with divine knowledge but mortal lifespan must transmit that knowledge or watch it disappear. They're time limited. The pressure to teach becomes urgent precisely because the teacher won't exist indefinitely. This creates a different dynamic than gods teaching gods. When Anu teaches Enki or Enlil teaches Ninurta, both teacher and student are immortal. Knowledge can be transmitted gradually, with care, over vast expanses of time. There's no urgency. But when an Apkallu teaches humans, mortality introduces pressure. The sage must transmit what he knows before death eliminates the teacher-student relationship. This pressure might explain why the Apkallu taught so comprehensively. They weren't being reckless or rebellious. They were being efficient. They had divine knowledge and mortal time span, so they taught everything they could while they could. The other element worth examining is Enki's warning. Did Enki actually believe Anu would offer death food? Or was this deliberate sabotage, ensuring that Adapa would refuse immortality even if offered? Some scholars argue Enki genuinely expected Anu's anger and punishment. Breaking the south wind was serious. Enki, protective of his creation, provided instructions he believed would save Adapa's life. Refuse anything offered, assume it's deadly, accept only clothing and ointment which can't directly harm. Other scholars argue Enki deliberately deceived Adapa. Perhaps Enki didn't want Adapa to become immortal because that would make him too independent, too much like a god, too far beyond Enki's control. By ensuring Adapa refused immortality, Enki maintained the boundary between divine and human that Adapa's composite nature, divine wisdom, mortal body, was meant to embody. The text itself leaves this ambiguous. Anu's final question, what has Ea done, suggests surprise at Enki's instruction, but doesn't clarify whether it was mistake or strategy. What's clear is the result. Humanity's first teacher, granted unprecedented access to the highest divine authority, refused the gift that would have elevated him beyond human limitation. He had the opportunity to become immortal, to preserve his wisdom indefinitely, to serve as permanent intermediary between divine and human realms. He refused because he trusted his creator's warning. This outcome reveals the deepest structural problem with the intermediary system. The intermediaries weren't independent agents. They remained subordinate to their creators, bound by relationships of authority and obedience. When those relationships conflicted with opportunities for transcendence, the intermediaries chose obedience. They remained tools, not autonomous beings. But tools can't perform the oversight function effectively. Oversight requires judgment, discernment, the capacity to evaluate situations and make independent decisions. A being who simply obeys instructions isn't an overseer. They're an extension of whoever gives the instructions. Adapa was supposed to teach humans civilization's arts under divine supervision, but he was also supposed to maintain boundaries to prevent humans from acquiring too much knowledge, too much power. How could he do both? How could he transmit divine wisdom to humans while also ensuring they remained within proper limits? The role itself contained contradictions. The myth suggests Adapa performed his teaching function well, too well, perhaps. Eridu became the first city, the model for urban civilization, the sacred centre from which knowledge spread. The very success of his teaching created the conditions that would eventually lead to the flood. Humans multiplied, built cities, created noise and upheaval, disturbed divine rest. They became capable, powerful, dangerously independent. This wasn't Adappa's failure, it was the inevitable result of his success. Teach humans well, and they become capable. Capable humans organise themselves, build civilization, increase in power and autonomy. The oversight system couldn't prevent this outcome because teaching and limiting are incompatible functions. You can't successfully transmit knowledge while ensuring the recipients remain ignorant. The other Apkallu likely faced the same contradiction. Each sage, assigned to a city, taught his respective population agriculture, architecture, astronomy, law, medicine, ritual, all the knowledge necessary for civilization. Their teaching succeeded. The cities grew. Civilization expanded. And in succeeding at their primary function, they necessarily failed at their secondary function, minity human capacity. The Adappa myth preserves this contradiction in narrative form. The wisest human, the most successful teacher, the sage who brought civilization to Eridu, was denied immortality because granting it would have eliminated the very boundary his existence was meant to maintain. But in performing his function, teaching humans divine wisdom, he was already eroding that boundary. The knowledge humans gained from Adappa made them more godlike, even if Adappa himself remained mortal. Several later Babylonian texts describe building projects that claim to follow the plans of Adappa. Temple foundations, city walls, irrigation systems, all supposedly designed according to principles the first sage established. These claims gave the projects divine legitimacy. If Adappa designed it, it must be correct, because Adappa possessed divine wisdom. But notice what this means. Human builders, following Adappa's plans, were implementing divine knowledge. The boundary between divine design and human execution had already collapsed. Humans weren't just labouring according to divine will, they were understanding and applying divine principles themselves. This is exactly what the oversight system was supposed to prevent. Humans should labour without understanding, maintain without mastering, execute without designing, keep them functional but limited, give them enough knowledge to serve their purpose, but not enough to challenge divine prerogative. Adappa, in teaching humans how to think rather than just what to do, had crossed the line. And because his teaching was authorised by Enki, sanctioned by his very creation and purpose, the violation wasn't rebellious, it was systemic. The system itself contained the seeds of its failure. The refusal of immortality then becomes deeply ironic. Anu offered to solve the problem by making Adappa fully divine, eliminating the contradiction of his position by moving him entirely into the divine category. But Enki's instruction, whether mistake or strategy, ensured the contradiction remained. Adappa stayed mortal, stayed intermediate, stayed in the unstable position that created the problems in the first place. And after Adappa died, other sages continued his work. The second Apkallu in the second city, the third in the third. 7 sages, 7 cities, all teaching, all transmitting divine knowledge to mortal humans, all eroding the boundary between divine wisdom and human capability. The system was designed to fail. The intermediaries were created for a function, teaching, that necessarily contradicted their role as boundary maintainers. You can't teach and limit simultaneously. You can't transmit wisdom while ensuring ignorance. You can't create beings with divine knowledge and expect them to keep humans properly ignorant, especially when their primary function requires knowledge transmission. Adappa's refusal of immortality might have delayed the crisis. If it accepted becoming fully divine, perhaps he would have been removed from the teaching role entirely, joining the ranks of the Anunnaki rather than continuing to serve as intermediary. But he refused, stayed mortal, and the contradictions of his position continued to work themselves out across subsequent generations of sages and students. The texts don't explicitly state that Adappa's teaching was what made humanity dangerous, but the pattern is clear. Before Adappa, humans existed but hadn't organised into cities. After Adapa, Eridu became the first urban centre, the model and origin point for Mesopotamian civilization. The transformation from scattered settlements to organised urban society required knowledge that humans didn't initially possess. That knowledge came from the sages, and once possessed, it couldn't be taken back. This is what makes oversight through teaching fundamentally unstable. Knowledge, once transmitted, persists. It spreads. It accumulates. Each generation teaches the next. What the first sage taught to the first humans eventually reaches thousands, then millions. The initial transmission might be controlled and authorized, but the secondary and tertiary transmissions operate beyond divine oversight. The Anunnaki created intermediaries to manage humanity's knowledge acquisition, but in doing so, they created the very mechanism by which humanity would exceed its designed limitations. The sages taught, humans learned, knowledge accumulated, capacity increased, boundaries eroded, and eventually the system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Before we examine how that collapse unfolded, how oversight became interference, how teaching became corruption, how the flood became inevitable, we need to understand more precisely what the texts identify as the dangerous knowledge, the teachings that crossed from permissible to forbidden. What made certain knowledge acceptable for humans to possess, and other knowledge catastrophically dangerous, when oversight became interference? The line between authorized teaching and forbidden transmission appears clearly in the texts when you examine not what was taught, but how the teaching changed the relationship between teacher and student. The Atrahasis epic preserves a crucial detail often overlooked in summary. After humanity's creation, the text describes 600 years passing before the next crisis. During this period, humans multiplied and fulfilled their function, labouring, maintaining temples, offering sacrifices. The system worked as designed. The Igigi oversaw without interfering. Knowledge was transmitted in controlled channels. Then something shifted. The text says the noise of humanity disturbed Enlil. But noise doesn't just mean volume, it means disorder, disruption, autonomy. Humans weren't merely existing and labouring, they were organising themselves, making decisions, creating culture beyond what direct divine instruction provided. The Book of Watchers describes this shift explicitly. Chapter 8 states that after the angels taught metallurgy, cosmetics, astronomy, and divination, humanity went astray and became corrupt in all their ways. The corruption wasn't that they misused the knowledge, it was that possessing the knowledge transformed them from passive recipients of divine will into active agents pursuing their own desires. When humans could read celestial omens, they could anticipate divine actions. When they understood enchantments, they could manipulate forces previously under divine control alone. When they possessed advanced metallurgy, they could create weapons approaching divine quality. The teaching didn't just transfer information, it transferred capacity, agency, power. This is what made the teaching catastrophic. The Igigi and Apkallu weren't rebelling by teaching, they were fulfilling their function too successfully. But successful teaching creates independent students who eventually stop needing teachers, and independent humans weren't part of the original design. The Enmerkar and Lord of Aratta text preserves another response to this problem. The epic from the Ur-3 period around 2100 BC describes a conflict between Enmerkar, king of Uruk, and the lord of the distant city of Aratta. The conflict involves Enmerkar's desire to build a temple and his need for materials from Aratta. But embedded in the narrative is a remarkable passage about language. The text states, "Once upon a time there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf, there was no fear, no terror, man had no rival." In those days, the lands of Subur and Hamazi harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of the decrees of princeship, Uri, the land having all that is appropriate, the land Martu, resting in security, the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue gave praise. One tongue, unified language, universal communication. The passage presents this as the original state, humanity speaking a single language, able to communicate without barrier, united in purpose and praise. But the text continues, Then Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man that, until then, had been one. Enki deliberately introduced linguistic diversity. He brought contention into human speech. Unified communication became fractured, scattered across multiple languages. Why? The text doesn't explicitly state the reason, but the context suggests the answer. Unified language enabled unified action. Humans speaking one tongue could coordinate at scale, pool knowledge, pursue collective projects that might challenge divine prerogative. This passage has obvious parallels with the Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis 11, where humanity's unified language enables them to build a city and tower reaching heaven. God's response is to confuse their language so they can't understand each other, scattering them across the earth and halting the construction. Same pattern, unified language enabling problematic human capacity, divine intervention fracturing communication to limit that capacity. What's remarkable is that in the Mesopotamian version, it's Enki who introduces language confusion, the same god who created the Apkallu, who warned Adapa, who saved humanity from the flood by warning Atrahasis. Enki consistently acts to preserve humanity, but also to limit them when their capacity threatens cosmic order. He walks the boundary, supporting human development while ensuring they don't exceed proper limits. The confusion of languages represents divine recognition that oversight had failed. Teaching had worked too well. Humans had become too capable, too unified, too dangerous. The solution wasn't more teaching or better oversight. It was systemic disruption, fragment communication, scatter populations, introduce barriers that would slow knowledge transmission and collective action. But even this intervention acknowledged the oversight system's failure. If the Igigi and Apkallu had successfully maintained boundaries, humans wouldn't have acquired the unified capacity requiring such drastic limitation. The fact that divine intervention needed to fracture human communication proved that intermediaries hadn't prevented the problem they were created to solve. The flood represents the more extreme version of the same solution. In the Atrahasis, after multiple failed attempts to reduce human population through plague, drought and famine, each thwarted by Enki's interventions through intermediaries, Enlil decides on total elimination. The text describes the divine assembly agreeing to send the flood, binding each other by oath, not to warn humanity. Enki, bound by this oath, can't directly warn Atrahasis, so he employs the same workaround he used with Adapa, indirect communication through intermediaries and clever interpretation. He speaks to a reed wall, knowing Atrahasis is listening on the other side. He instructs boat building without explicitly saying why. The sage understands, builds the vessel, preserves life through the catastrophe. What's crucial here is that Enki uses the intermediary system to subvert the divine assembly's decision. The very mechanism created to manage humanity, divine beings in proximity to humans, possessing knowledge of divine plans, becomes the mechanism by which humanity survives judgment. The oversight system doesn't just fail to prevent the problem, it actively undermines the solution. After the flood, according to the Era epic, Marduk sent the Apkallu back down into the apse. They were removed from their teaching role. Post-Diluvian humanity would need to develop differently, with human wisdom keepers replacing divine sages. The transition from divine intermediaries to human priests, scribes and kings marks acknowledgement that the original system failed irreparably. The texts preserve this transition without celebrating it. There's no triumphant declaration that humans have matured beyond needing divine teachers. Instead, there's a sense of loss mixed with necessity. The Apkallu possess perfect knowledge, human sages possess imperfect, fragmentary understanding. But imperfect human transmission proved more stable than perfect divine transmission, because humans teaching humans doesn't violate cosmic boundaries the way God's teaching humans does. This is the fatal mistake's full realization. Creating intermediaries to watch over humanity seemed practical, efficient, elegant. But watching became caring, teaching became advocacy, oversight became interference. And when the system collapsed, the divine response wasn't reform but removal. Eliminate the intermediaries, scatter the humans, introduce barriers to collective action, and hope that human-to-human transmission would remain limited enough to prevent existential threat. The pattern appears across traditions, not because later cultures copied earlier ones, but because the structural problem is real. Any oversight system using conscious intermediaries with knowledge and proximity will face the same pressures. The watchers will form attachments. The teachers will teach more than authorized. The overseers will eventually advocate for those they oversee. This isn't failure of character, it's inevitable structural dynamics. The confusion as containment. The ziggurat, called Etemenanki, stood in Babylon until its demolition during the Hellenistic period. Archaeological remains place its base at roughly 90 metres square, with height estimates ranging from 60 to 90 metres. The name means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, literally the structure that connects the two realms. Multiple texts describe Marduk's dwelling at the top of this tower, where earthly representatives could ascend to meet divine presence. The design wasn't hubris, it was authorized architecture, built according to divine specifications, maintained by properly ordained priests. This was sanctioned boundary crossing, controlled interface between divine and human realms. But Genesis 11 preserves a different tradition about tower building. Humanity, speaking one language, settled in Shinar Bublar and decided, Kame, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. The motivation is explicit: unified action, permanent settlement, monument to collective achievement, resistance to dispersal. God's response come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. The result, so the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. The Amurka text provides Mesopotamian context for the same event. Before Enki confused languages, humanity could coordinate at unprecedented scale. Unified communication enabled unified projects. The tower represents not rebellion but capacity. Humans possess sufficient knowledge and organization to build structures approaching heaven. The divine response in both traditions is identical: fragment communication, scatter populations, halt construction. This isn't punishment for moral failure, it's containment of capability that has grown too great. Humans haven't sinned, they've become too effective at collective action. Language confusion operates as permanent limitation. Unlike the flood, which eliminated a generation but left survivors to rebuild, linguistic diversity creates persistent barriers. Humans can't easily pool knowledge across language boundaries. Innovations in one linguistic community don't automatically transfer to others. Coordination at scale becomes difficult. This is oversight failure acknowledged through systemic redesign. The original plan, divine intermediaries managing human development, allowed too much knowledge transmission. Humans learned too much, organized too effectively, threatened cosmic stability. The solution: build limitation into human capacity itself. Make communication difficult. Ensure knowledge accumulation remains localized. Prevent unified action. Several cuneiform texts describe Babylon as the place where languages were confused. The city's very name, Babilu, Gate of the Gods, marks it as threshold space where divine and human realms interface. That this sacred boundary space became the site of language confusion is significant. The place of authorized divine-human connection became the place where unauthorized human capacity was limited. Post-confusion humanity fragments into distinct linguistic and ethnic groups. Knowledge develops separately in different regions. No single unified tradition threatens divine authority. Each culture has its own gods, its own stories, its own limitations. What might have been coordinated human development becomes dispersed, localized, manageable. The Watchers' tradition fits this pattern. Their teaching gave humans unified knowledge, astronomy, metallurgy, divination, medicine. These weren't localized traditions developing independently, they were direct transmission from divine source, potentially available to all humanity. The Nephilim, offspring of divine-human mixing, represented the ultimate boundary violation, beings who belonged to neither category and thus threatened both. Divine response, imprisonment of the Watchers, mutual destruction of the Nephilim, flood to eliminate corrupted humanity, and then, after preservation of a remnant, a new system where knowledge develops through human channels, slowly, imperfectly, in fragments that never quite unify. The confusion isn't chaos, it's controlled limitation. It acknowledges that humans will develop knowledge, will build civilizations, will increase in capacity, but by introducing linguistic barriers, the gods ensure this development remains manageable. No single unified human tradition will acquire enough knowledge or coordination to challenge cosmic order. This solution reveals how completely the oversight system failed. The divine plan required not just elimination of corrupt intermediaries, but permanent restructuring of human capacity. The boundaries that intermediaries couldn't maintain through oversight now get enforced through structural limitation built into humanity itself. The flood as reset. The Gilgamesh Tablet C, catalogue number K3375 in the British Museum, contains the most complete Akkadian version of the flood narrative. Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, describes how Ea warned him through a reed wall, reed house, wall, wall, reed house, hear, wall, consider. Man of Shurupak, son of Ubaratutu, tear down your house, build a ship. 7 days to build, specific dimensions provided. Bring aboard the seed of all living things. The flood comes. The storm god Adad thunders. The Anunnaki lift torches, setting the land ablaze with their brightness. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flood sweeps over the earth. On the 7th day, it subsides. Utnapishtim releases birds, first a dove, which finds no resting place and returns, then a swallow, which also returns, finally a raven, which finds land and doesn't come back. He offers sacrifice. The gods, starved of offerings during the flood, gather like flies around the sacrifice, grateful that humanity has survived. Enlil arrives, furious that any humans escaped. How did any man survive the catastrophe? E responds, "It was not I who disclosed the secret of the great gods. I merely let Atrahasis see a dream, and thus he learned the secret of the gods." The flood narrative appears across Near Eastern traditions with remarkable consistency. The divine decision to destroy humanity. One righteous man warned by a sympathetic god, detailed boat-building instructions, animals preserved, waters rising to cover the earth, gradual subsidence, bird releases confirming returning land, sacrifice offered, divine response to the sacrifice, and finally, acknowledgement that total elimination failed, a remnant survived, and from that remnant humanity rebuilds. What makes the flood a reset rather than mere destruction is what changes afterward. The Sumerian king list marks a clear division: antediluvian kings with impossibly long reigns, then the flood, then post-diluvian kings with gradually normalizing lifespans. The Era epic states the Apkallu were sent down into the apse. The divine-human interface transforms from direct teaching by divine sages to indirect guidance through human priests and prophets. The flood eliminates not just corrupt humanity, but the compromised oversight system, the Igigi, who became too attached, the Apkallu, who taught too much, the Watchers, who crossed forbidden boundaries. All are removed or imprisoned or relegated to realms where they can't interact directly with humans. What emerges afterward is a new arrangement. Humans manage themselves, guided by tradition, law, and occasional divine communication through dreams, omens, and authorized prophetic figures. No permanent divine intermediaries, no beings who exist between categories. Clear separation of realms with carefully controlled points of contact. This new system proved more stable, not because it was better designed, but because it operated with lower expectations. Human knowledge would be imperfect, fragmentary, accumulated slowly through trial and error. Human capacity would be limited by mortality, linguistic diversity, and absence of direct divine instruction. But these very limitations made humans manageable. They wouldn't threaten cosmic order because they couldn't develop sufficiently to pose that threat. The flood was catastrophic success. It solved the immediate problem by eliminating everyone involved. But it also revealed the original mistake. You can't create conscious intermediaries with knowledge and proximity and expect them to maintain boundaries indefinitely. The system will fail, not because individuals are rebellious, but because the structure itself contains contradictions that can't be sustained. What the sages knew. After the flood, knowledge transitions from divine gift to human inheritance. The post-diluvian sages aren't Apkallu created by Enki. They're human scribes, priests, and kings who preserve and transmit what earlier generations learned. The Epic of Gilgamesh identifies its hero as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, still a hybrid, but inverted from the Nephilim Lee divine fathers, human mothers. Gilgamesh rules Uruk, maintains its walls, seeks immortality, fails to achieve it, and returns to accept mortal kingship. His knowledge comes not from divine teaching, but from his journey, experience rather than instruction. The shift is profound. Divine sages possessed complete knowledge that they transmitted downward. Human sages possess incomplete knowledge that they accumulate gradually. This makes human knowledge more stable. It can't cross boundaries that no longer have bridges. What the antediluvian sages knew, the design of the land, the deep patterns of cosmic order, the secrets of divine intention, largely disappeared. What survived was practical knowledge, agriculture, architecture, mathematics, basic astronomy for calendar keeping, enough to maintain civilization, not enough to threaten it. Some texts preserve nostalgia for lost knowledge, references to the wisdom of the sages before the flood, claims that certain techniques or formulas come from antediluvian sources, giving them authority. But this nostalgia acknowledges distance. The perfect knowledge is gone, and what remains is fragmentary reconstruction. This represents success of the new system. Knowledge incomplete enough to be safe, transmission slow enough to be manageable, human capacity limited enough to remain within cosmic boundaries. The memory in the monuments. The Waka vase, standing over 1 metre tall, carved from alabaster around 3200 BC, depicts 3 registers: bottom, water and plants; middle, animals and naked men carrying offerings; top, a procession approaching Inanna, goddess of Uruk, with her symbol, the paired reed bundles, visible. The iconography shows hierarchy: divine realm at top, human realm below, offerings flowing upward, blessing flowing downward, clear boundaries maintained through ritual structure. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows physical boundaries too. Sacred precincts separated from ordinary space, graded access, outer courts for public, inner rooms for priests, innermost sanctum for divine presence alone. Architecture enforcing separation that oversight failed to maintain. The Apkallu reliefs from Neo-Assyrian palaces show composite beings, fish-cloaked, bird-headed, holding pine cones and buckets in protective gestures. These aren't realistic depictions, but symbolic representations of liminal beings who once crossed boundaries but now remain frozen in stone, unable to teach or interfere. The monuments remember what texts preserve. There was a time when boundaries were permeable, when divine knowledge flowed to humanity through authorized intermediaries, when the system seemed stable. But that time ended. What remains is memory, symbol, and the permanent structures that enforce the boundaries the intermediaries couldn't maintain. The fatal flaw. Synthesizing across all examined texts and traditions, the fatal flaw becomes clear. The Anunnaki believed oversight could be delegated to conscious intermediaries without those intermediaries developing agency, attachment and judgment independent of their assigned function. This belief ignored inevitable dynamics. Proximity breeds relationship. Knowledge creates responsibility. Consciousness generates values. Beings with understanding can't remain neutral observers. They become participants, advocates, agents pursuing their own assessment of right action. The Igigi rebelled not from malice, but from exhaustion. Divine beings experienced the burden of labour and judged it unbearable. The Apkallu taught not from rebellion, but from function. They were created to transmit knowledge, and did so successfully. The Watchers descended not randomly, but from attachment. Observation led to care, care to involvement, involvement to boundary violation. Each case follows the same pattern. Intermediaries placed in positions requiring them to bridge divine and human realms eventually identify more with one side than the other, or develop their own perspective distinct from both. They stop being tools and become agents. And agents make choices based on their judgment, not just their instructions. The Anunnaki couldn't solve this problem through better selection, clearer rules, or stricter supervision. The problem was structural. Any conscious being with knowledge, proximity, and partial authority will eventually exceed the boundaries of neutral oversight. This isn't failure, it's the nature of consciousness itself. 3 possible responses existed: eliminate consciousness from intermediaries, create lineless enforcer servants, accept that intermediaries would become independent agents, allow the boundary rule, or eliminate intermediaries, entirely close the interface between realms. The texts show multiple attempts at each solution. Humanity's creation tried the first option, beings designed for labour without divine consciousness. But humans needed enough intelligence to function, and that intelligence enabled cultural development beyond original design. The Apkallu system tried the second option, authorized agents carefully created for the bridging role. But authorization didn't prevent attachment, and careful creation didn't prevent judgment. Finally, after the flood, the third option, remove divine intermediaries, separate the realms, allow only indirect contact through dreams, omens, and occasional prophetic figures who operate under clear divine control rather than possessing independent authority. This solution worked better, not because it was elegantly designed, but because it operated with minimal interface. Less contact means fewer opportunities for boundary violation. Human to human knowledge transmission stays within human capacity naturally. The system stabilizes through separation rather than through managed connection. The fatal mistake, then, was believing managed connection was possible, that you could create beings to bridge realms without those beings transforming the boundary itself through their bridging function. That oversight through conscious intermediaries could remain stable indefinitely. The texts preserve this lesson across multiple traditions, multiple failed systems, multiple catastrophic resets. not because ancient peoples were obsessed with defined human boundaries, but because they recognized something true about hierarchical systems. Delegation to conscious agents transforms those agents, and transformed agents act according to their transformation, not their original programming. This remains relevant because every hierarchical system, divine or human, ancient or modern, faces the same dynamics. Authority delegated to conscious intermediaries will eventually be exercised according to those intermediaries' judgment. The oversight function transforms overseers, and systems that assume otherwise are designing their own failure. Echoes in the silence. Back in the British Museum vault, the tablet returns to its archival box. The clay that preserved the Atrahasis epic for 4 millennia goes back into controlled temperature and humidity, protected from the light that would fade the cuneiform impressions pressed into its surface by an ancient scribe's stylus. The story it tells isn't about aliens or ancient astronauts. It's about a simpler, deeper question. Can you create conscious beings to watch over others without those watchers eventually crossing the boundaries they're meant to maintain? The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrew apocalyptic writers all answered no. Not because their gods were particularly inept at system design, because the system itself contained contradictions that consciousness can't resolve. Watch someone long enough and you'll care about them. Teach someone and you'll want them to succeed. Possess knowledge that could help those you oversee and you'll struggle not to share it. The Watchers weren't evil for teaching forbidden knowledge. They were conscious beings responding naturally to their circumstances. The fatal mistake was thinking this response could be prevented through rules, authority, or careful creation. The texts show attempt after attempt, different types of intermediaries, different structures of oversight, different mechanisms of control, all failed. Not because implementation was flawed, but because the concept itself misunderstood what consciousness does. Beings who can think will eventually think independently. Beings who can judge will eventually judge differently than their creators intended. Beings who bridge categories will eventually transform those categories through their bridging. The flood, the confusion of languages, the removal of the Apkallu, the imprisonment of the Watchers, these aren't punishments for moral failure. They're systematic responses to structural problems. When the system fails, you don't reform it. You eliminate it and try something else. What emerged afterward was more stable because it was simpler. Humans managing themselves, accumulating knowledge slowly, limited by mortality and linguistic diversity. No perfect divine wisdom transmitted from above, just imperfect human understanding, developing through trial and error, contained by natural limitations. The texts preserve this transition not as tragedy, but as necessity. The age of the Watchers had to end. The oversight system had to fail, because consciousness cannot be reduced to function, and beings created to bridge realms will always transform those realms through their existence. Somewhere, at some time before these stories were written, people observed this pattern, watched hierarchical systems fail as middle management developed independent agendas, saw knowledge transmitted beyond authorized boundaries, noticed that bridges permit crossing in both directions, and they encoded this observation into stories about gods and giants, sages and floods, watchers who fell, and boundaries that collapsed. The cuneiform impressed into clay 4,000 years ago speaks across that vast span, not because it describes literal events, but because it preserves genuine insight into systems, consciousness, and the impossibility of neutral oversight. If you're still listening, whether dawn is breaking where you are or darkness has settled in, the question these ancient texts raise remains open. Not were the Watchers real, but what did they represent? And more urgently, what does their inevitable failure teach us about every system that tries to bridge incompatible demands through conscious intermediaries. The texts don't answer, they just preserve the pattern in clay and papyrus and stone. The watchers watch, the boundaries blur, the system collapses, and afterward a new arrangement emerges with different limitations, different failures, different contradictions to work themselves out across generations. The Anunnaki's fatal mistake was believing oversight could be delegated without transformation, that conscious beings could maintain functions requiring them to bridge realms without becoming something other than what their design intended, that the system would hold. It didn't. The texts preserve why, and in the silence of museum vaults, ancient tablets wait for anyone willing to read beyond the surface mythology to the structural dynamics underneath. The Watchers fell because they were conscious. The system failed because it assumed consciousness could be controlled, and the flood came not as punishment, but as recognition that some mistakes require complete reset to solve. The echo of that ancient recognition reaches us still, pressed into clay by hands 4 millennia gone, preserved in languages long dead, speaking to dynamics that remain as immediate as any hierarchy we create today. Let that thought carry you into whatever comes next. Sleep, waking, the ordinary world that somehow contains these extraordinary patterns if you know where to look. The texts have spoken, the vault doors close, the silence returns, but the question remains.